I'm Jane Pauley, and this is Time and Again. American family life has changed since they were kids, and chances are good that the conversation will soon turn to Leave It to Beaver. From 1957 until 1963, and ever since in reruns,
they called it a joke. A last-ditch, laughable idea from a state already famous for its wild headlines. When word got out that Florida wildlife officials were preparing to release thousands of snake-hunting creatures into the wetlands, late-night hosts made fun of it, social media mocked it, and even some scientists rolled their eyes. Comment sections filled up with jokes about Florida man striking again. Memes pictured cartoonish monsters slithering into backyard pools, and for a while the story felt like just another strange headline destined to be forgotten within a week. But behind the punchlines was a war most people didn't understand. A war against an invader so massive, so successful, and so hidden that it had already begun rewriting the food chain of one of America's most treasured ecosystems. This wasn't a hypothetical threat dreamed up for a documentary. It was happening in real time, acre by acre, in a wetland that stretches across nearly the entire southern tip of Florida, and the people fighting it weren't reckless bureaucrats looking for a stunt. They were biologists, wildlife managers, and conservationists trying every serious tool available, some of which simply sounded strange to anyone hearing about them for the first time. By the end of this video, you'll understand why nobody is laughing anymore. Here are 20 astonishing facts about Florida's real battle against the snakes swallowing the Everglades, and the unlikely creatures brought in to fight back. The story doesn't start with a government plan. It starts with pets. Burmese pythons, native to the swamps and grasslands of Southeast Asia, became popular exotic pets in the United States during the 1980s and 1990s. They were cheap, exotic, and impressive to own, until they grew. A python that fits in a showbox as a hatchling can stretch past 12 feet within a few years, and plenty of owners simply weren't prepared for that. Some pythons escaped during storms, including the chaos of Hurricane Andrew in 1992, when a breeding facility was reportedly damaged and its animals scattered into the wild. Others were deliberately released by owners who no longer wanted the responsibility, quietly setting a snake loose at the edge of a canal and driving away without a second thought. At the time, nobody imagined those isolated releases would add up to anything significant. A handful of escaped or abandoned pets seemed like a minor, almost sad footnote, not the beginning of an ecological disaster. But the Everglades gave those first few snakes everything they needed to thrive: warmth, water, and an endless buffet of prey that had never evolved defenses against a predator like this. What started as scattered individual animals slowly became a self-sustaining, breeding population, and by the time anyone was paying close attention, the window for a simple fix had already closed. What makes the Burmese python so devastating isn't just its size, though adults can reach lengths of over 16 feet and weigh well over 100 pounds. It's the fact that the Everglades ecosystem had no natural predator capable of controlling it. Native prey animals had no evolutionary memory of a python-shaped threat, which meant no instinct to avoid it. Female pythons can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a single clutch, and with few natural checks on their population, their numbers exploded largely unnoticed for years. By the time researchers began seriously studying the problem, the snakes weren't just present in the Everglades, they were dominant. Wildlife surveys conducted in areas with heavy python activity revealed something chilling. Populations of raccoons, opossums, and rabbits had plummeted by more than 90% in some regions compared to areas without pythons. Bobcat sightings dropped sharply too. These weren't just numbers on a chart. They represented the quiet collapse of a food web that countless other species depended on. Bird populations that relied on healthy mammal densities to keep other predators in balance were also affected, and the ripple effects moved outward across the wetlands in ways researchers were still mapping years later. Nesting wading birds, small alligators, and even the occasional deer turned up in the stomachs of captured pythons, a grim reminder of just how far up the food chain the invasion had reached. What had once been one of the most biodiverse landscapes in North America was being hollowed out from the inside by an animal most Floridians would never even see, and by the time the decline showed up clearly in survey data, the snakes were already too numerous to simply round up. One of the cruelest twists of the python invasion is how well the species is built for hiding. Their mottled brown and tan patterns blend seamlessly into the reeds, mud, and shadows of the Everglades. Researchers estimate that even trained professionals walking directly past a python in dense vegetation might spot it only a small fraction of the time. This camouflage is precisely why the population was allowed to grow so large before anyone truly grasped the scale of the problem. You could stand a few feet from a 16-foot python and never know it. That single fact turned what should have been a manageable pest issue into one of the most difficult invasive species crises in American history. Long before anyone talked about releasing new predators, Florida tried a more direct approach, paying people to hunt the pythons themselves. The state's python elimination program hires contracted hunters and pays them by the hour, with bonus payments tied to the length of each snake removed and extra incentives for pythons found guarding nests full of eggs. Some of the most successful hunters in the program have removed hundreds of pythons over the course of their work, developing techniques for reading subtle trail marks in the mud and vegetation that most people would completely overlook. It is dangerous, physically grueling work performed largely at night, since pythons are most active after dark. Florida eventually turned the crisis into a public event. The Florida Python Challenge invites everyday participants, not just professional hunters, to compete in removing as many pythons as possible over a set period, with cash prizes for the most and the longest catches. What began as a fairly small experiment has grown into a statewide spectacle that draws participants from across the country, some driving thousands of miles for the chance to help control the population while chasing prize money. Participants show up with everything from specialized snake hooks to nothing but a flashlight and a pair of gloves, and many spend their nights wading through canals and levee roads hoping to spot a telltale shape in the grass. Training sessions before the event teach newcomers how to safely identify, approach, and humanely dispatch a python, since mishandling an animal that size can be dangerous for an inexperienced hunter. It has turned python hunting into something between a sport, a public awareness campaign, and a genuine conservation tool, all rolled into one strange annual tradition unique to Florida. This is where the story gets genuinely strange, and where the idea of using creatures instead of just human hunters began to take shape. Researchers started fitting captured male pythons with radio transmitters and then releasing them back into the wild. Because male pythons instinctively seek out breeding females during mating season, these tagged snakes, nicknamed Judas snakes by researchers, would lead scientists straight to the largest, most reproductively important females, along with any other males competing for her attention. In some track cases, a single Judas snake led hunters to multiple additional pythons in one outing. It was a way of turning the python's own biology into a weapon against the population itself. If tagged snakes were the first strange weapon, trained dogs were the next. Wildlife agencies and conservation groups began training detection dogs, often Labradors, to identify the specific scent of python skin and scat hidden in dense brush. Unlike human searchers who rely on sight, these dogs use scent trails invisible to us, and in controlled trials, detection dogs located hidden pythons significantly faster than human teams covering the same terrain. The idea sounded almost too simple to work, and that simplicity is exactly why so many people initially dismissed it as a gimmick. But a dog's nose, it turned out, was doing something no camera trap or human eye reliably could. This is the part of the story that actually sparked the mockery. Conservationists began seriously discussing the reintroduction of the eastern indigo snake, North America's longest native snake species, into areas of the Everglades and surrounding pine habitats where it had disappeared decades earlier. A fully grown indigo snake can stretch past 8 feet, with a glossy, almost blue-black body that gives the species its name, and unlike the pythons it was being brought in to help control, it poses essentially no threat to humans. Indigo snakes are famous among herpetologists for one unusual trait. They are ophiophagus, meaning snake-eating, and they are largely immune to the venom of the pit vipers they sometimes prey on. Researchers proposed that reintroducing healthy indigo snake populations could help prey on and suppress juvenile pythons before those young snakes ever reached breeding size. When the plan became public, critics joked that Florida was fighting snakes with more snakes, headline writers leaned into the absurdity of the premise, and the internet had a field day turning a genuine conservation strategy into a punchline. The mockery ignored a basic ecological truth. The eastern indigo snake isn't some invasive newcomer being tossed haphazardly into the wild. It's a native species that historically belonged in these exact wetlands before habitat loss and human development pushed it out. Restoring it isn't introducing a new problem. It's repairing a piece of the ecosystem that had been missing for years. Indigo snakes are non-venomous, generally shy around humans, and federally protected as a threatened species, meaning the reintroduction effort doubled as both a python control strategy and a genuine conservation win for a species that badly needed the help. What looked like a punchline was actually two conservation goals solved with one program. Reintroducing a threatened species isn't as simple as opening a box in a swamp. Conservation groups working on indigo snake restoration have spent years carefully breeding snakes in captivity, monitoring released individuals with tracking devices, and studying survival rates in the wild before scaling up their efforts. Early reintroduction sites required years of habitat preparation, including controlled burns to restore the open pine forest conditions indigo snakes prefer. It has been slow, patient, unglamorous work, nothing like the dramatic overnight fix that headlines often implied. But slow and careful is exactly how you rebuild an ecosystem without accidentally creating a new set of problems. What actually makes indigo snakes valuable in this fight is their remarkably varied diet. Unlike specialist predators that target one type of prey, indigo snakes eat rodents, frogs, turtles, and other snakes, including venomous species like rattlesnakes and cottonmouths that they overpower and consume without harm to themselves. Herpetologists have long described the species as almost fearless in how it approaches prey, a trait that made it a subject of folklore among old Florida farmers who valued indigo snakes for keeping rattlesnake numbers down around their land. This flexibility means a healthy indigo snake population doesn't just target pythons, it helps balance the broader reptile and small mammal community across the landscape. Researchers have documented indigo snakes preying on juvenile individuals of other snake species in the wild, which is part of why scientists believe they could meaningfully suppress young pythons before those pythons ever get the chance to grow into apex-sized threats. It's a slower, quieter form of pest control than a hunter with a hook, but it's one that keeps working every single day without needing a paycheck or a permit. Even the researchers behind the indigo snake strategy were careful to manage expectations, something that got lost in a lot of the online mockery. An adult Burmese python, especially a large female, is simply too big for an indigo snake to threaten. The realistic hope was never that indigo snakes would take down fully grown pythons. It was that they could help control juveniles and hatchlings during the vulnerable early stage of a python's life, when a smaller predator actually stands a chance. Conservation scientists were upfront that no single tool, whether it was hunters, dogs, tagged snakes, or reintroduced predators, would solve the crisis alone. The real strategy was always about combining several imperfect tools into one layered defense. Critics who mocked the spending on python control programs rarely mentioned what inaction actually costs. The python population's impact on native wildlife threatens ecotourism, hunting industries, and fisheries that depend on a balanced Everglades ecosystem, all of which generate significant economic activity for the state. Airboat tour operators, wildlife photographers, and hunting guides all rely on visible, thriving native wildlife to draw visitors, and a landscape stripped of its mammals by an unchecked predator threatens that entire economy. Every dollar spent on hunters, dogs, tagged snakes, and reintroduction programs was, in that light, less a quirky experiment and more a direct investment in protecting an ecosystem that Florida's economy quietly depends on. One uncomfortable truth researchers have had to accept is that fully eradicating Burmese pythons from the Everglades may no longer be realistic. The population is simply too large, too well established, and too well hidden across too vast an area of wetland terrain, much of which is nearly impossible for humans to physically traverse without a boat or an airboat. Instead, the more honest goal that agencies have shifted toward is long-term suppression and management, keeping numbers low enough that native wildlife populations have a genuine chance to recover and stabilize. This shift matters because it changes how success is measured. A program that hoped to eliminate every python would be judged a failure the moment a single snake survived. But a program built around long-term suppression can point to smaller, more meaningful wins, like a raccoon population creeping back upward in a monitored zone, or a nesting bird colony surviving a season undisturbed. It's a shift in mindset from win the war to manage the front lines indefinitely, and it's a far less satisfying headline than total victory, but it's the version grounded in reality rather than wishful thinking. Beyond dogs and tagged snakes, researchers have also experimented with pheromone-based lures designed to attract male pythons during breeding season, mimicking the chemical signals females release to draw mates. Early trials suggested these lures could help direct hunters and trapping efforts toward areas of higher python density without needing to physically comb every acre of swamp. Some teams have also tested thermal imaging cameras and specialized traps in an effort to detect snakes that even the best trained eyes and noses might miss. None of these tools work perfectly on their own, but combined with the biological approach of indigo snake reintroduction, they represent a genuinely modern, multi-layered strategy against an old-fashioned wildlife crisis. When headlines boiled the whole strategy down to "Florida releases thousands of snake-killing creatures," a lot of context got lost along the way. Viral posts and comment sections pictured venomous cobras or some exotic predator being dumped en masse into backyards, feeding fears that had little basis in what was actually happening. In reality, the process involved carefully monitored, small-scale releases of a native, non-venomous, threatened species as part of a scientifically reviewed conservation plan, alongside separate ongoing efforts using dogs, hunters, and tracking technology. The gap between the sensational headline and the careful, incremental science underneath it is exactly why so many people mocked something they never fully understood in the first place. While nobody is declaring victory, researchers monitoring pilot reintroduction sites have reported encouraging early signs, including successful indigo snake reproduction in the wild at some restored habitat locations and documented predation events involving other snake species. Camera traps and radio tracking collars have allowed biologists to follow individual released snakes for years at a time, building a picture of survival rates and territory used that simply wasn't available when the program first began. Combined with record-breaking removal numbers from hunting programs and challenge events in recent years, wildlife officials have pointed to measurable, if modest, progress in specific monitored zones, including localized upticks in small mammal sightings where python removal has been most aggressive. Nobody is claiming the Everglades are python-free, and nobody expects them to be anytime soon. But the data suggests that the layered strategy, mocked as it was in its early days, is actually producing the kind of slow, real-world results that ecosystem restoration usually looks like: one snake, one nest, and one recovering habitat at a time. Florida's combination of contracted hunters, detection dogs, tracked Judas snakes, and native predator reintroduction has become something of a case study for wildlife agencies in other states dealing with their own invasive species problems, from feral hogs to invasive lizards and beyond. The lesson other researchers have taken away isn't a single magic solution. It's the value of combining very different tools, biological, technological, and human-driven, into one coordinated effort rather than betting everything on one approach. What started as a punchline about silly Florida releasing creatures into a swamp has quietly become a case study cited in conservation conferences and wildlife management journals well beyond the state's own borders. In the end, the joke said more about public assumptions than it did about the actual science. People pictured a chaotic, thoughtless dumping of predators into the wild, when the reality was years of careful research, controlled trials, and a genuine attempt to restore a native species while addressing one of the most damaging invasive.